Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd. On this final episode of my little series on the Humber Ferry, we're going to be taking a look at the lives of the last 3 coal-fired paddle steamers to work the ferry, affectionately known to locals as the Castles. Over the years there have been many ferry boats that have carried the people of Hull across to New Holland and vice versa, starting with the Magna Charta back in the 1830s, and then through names such as the Doncaster and the Manchester, all the way through to the last ones, which are the ones that people to this day still remember. The 3 boats collectively built between 1935 and 1940 that are still affectionately remembered as the Castles. And this is their story. As the ageing fleet of ferryboats was nearing the end of their collective lives in the 1930s, an order was placed by the ferry owners, the London and North East Railway, with Sir William Gray and Company, a shipbuilder in Hartlepool, commissioned to build 2 new paddle steamers. Ships for the Humber Ferry had to be specially designed due to the unusual geography of the Humber. Whilst the vast amount of water and mud that flows through it does indeed carve some deep water channels, much of the rest of the estuary's width is surprisingly shallow, and it's all too easy to beach a boat that has a deep draft. So this order for the 2 steamers came with a list of specifications needed for this specific work. Shallow drafts and flat bottoms to avoid becoming stranded on mudflats, paddles instead of a screw-driven propeller which could get stuck in the mud if it did become beached, a broad hull to provide stability, and extra hull reinforcement to cope with the stresses of the inevitable beaching on those mudflats. These twins took shape in the shipyard at Hartlepool and were delivered to the Humber in 1934 as Tattershall Castle and Wingfield Castle, where they proved themselves excellent boats, reliable and dependable, running the ferry and taking over most of the duties of the now ageing Killinghome, the last of the old steamers that was still running. But the twins weren't quite enough, and another boat of the same design was ordered, only this time from A.J. English, a shipbuilder on the Clyde in Glasgow, Scotland. Lincoln Castle would have by far the biggest adventure, as it was completed in 1940, by which time Britain was at war. Now ordinarily, if you built a boat in the Clyde and you want to send it to Hull, you would go south through the relatively calm waters of the English Channel. However, this was 1940, and just in case your history is a little wonky, there was a war on, and the Germans were bombing the hell out of any shipping they could find in the Channel as an attempt to try and starve Britain out. So the only route for the plucky little steamer was to go north, and she set sail as part of a flotilla to the stormy waters of the Scottish coast. Unfortunately, when she set sail, it was wintertime in 1940, and the storms were so severe that she took so much damage she ended up having to sail back to the Clyde for repairs. But the second time she set sail was a little more successful, but they almost came a cropper whilst coming down the east coast when a lone Stuka bomber was spotted and flew over them. Now, luckily, the bomber clearly had no bombs on board, otherwise it would have maybe made a run at them. But the plucky crew of the Lincoln decided to get up on the roof where a pintle-mounted machine gun had been put, because obviously we were at war, and they started taking pot shots at the aircraft. And whether it was the pot shots or whether it was just the fact that the Stuka had already gotten his scouting information, the plane turned tail and fled. And it's on record that the crew of the Lincoln Castle actually wanted to pursue the Stuka over the horizon, which bearing in mind the extremely slow speed of paddle steamers, was probably mindlessly optimistic. When Lincoln Castle arrived in Hull, it soon joined the twins in service on the ferry. Many civilian ships across the country during the war were commandeered by the Navy for use as troop transports or minesweepers, but the Humber ferries were made immune to this due to the unique nature of their builds, making them the only boats that could do this particular job, making them extremely vital to military connections between the north and south banks of the Humber. They moved troops, vehicles and supplies back and forth, and on an evening after the ferry runs were over, the three castles and the elderly Killinghome had a further job to do. They served as mobile barrage balloon platforms moving around in the Humber to throw off the German bombers. It's a testament to the build quality and design of all three of these boats that they gave no mechanical problems despite all of this constant use over the war, night and day. And their crews were also to be respected. There were no records of collisions, no casualties, not even any near misses on the river. Their wartime record was spotless. In 1945, after the end of the war, Killinghome was finally retired from service, leaving the three castles to carry on running the ferry. In early 1948, Tattershall Castle was given an experimental radar system, one of the first merchant vessels in the country to have one, and it made a huge difference to navigating the busy estuary. As soon as it was turned on, the crew were delighted to see it identifying a number of ships and boats, and it allowed the Tattershall Castle to make nighttime runs as well as runs through fog banks. It didn't take long before Wingfield and Lincoln Castles got their own radar systems. In 1948, ownership of the ferry passed from the LNER to British Railways as a result of the nationalisation of the railways, but locally not much changed other than a new paint job on the castles. It was still business as usual, with the three steamers running like clockwork with only minor breakdowns. British Railways kept up a strict routine of servicing and overhauls on the boats, which ensured their availability and their reliability. So as we saw in the first part of this series, the Humber Bridge would prove to be the downfall of the ferry. The construction began in 1972, and the construction company responsible for it did say that it was only going to be 2 years before it was open, which, when you think about it, is just mindless optimism at its very worst. Ultimately, not only was this going to be enormous, for many years it was the longest single-span suspension bridge in the world, but it was also constructed using an experimental concrete casting process. It's the first bridge in the world to use concrete to build its towers, a form called slip casting, and with an experimental process like that, 2 years is, well, let's just say that it was wildly optimistic. But that didn't stop British Railways from assuming that that 2 years was pretty much written in stone, and as a result they took the decision to withhold or even cancel routine scheduled maintenance to keep the castles up and running at their peak operating condition. Presumably they didn't want to waste money and time on vessels that were planning to be mothballed within 2 years. That proved to be a poor decision on reflection. The first casualty was Tattershall Castle. During the miners' strike of 1972, she was running the ferry single-handedly on a reduced service to conserve coal, and in late 1973, that hard work that she endured without maintenance took its toll on her boiler, and she had to be laid up and decommissioned, the first casualty of British Rail's neglect of their maintenance schedule. She was sold to become a floating conference centre and exhibition space on the Thames in London, and towed away to begin a new life in the big city, moored up near the Embankment, where she spent several years before being bought by a pub chain in 1981 and extensively renovated, eventually losing her paddle wheels and the distinctive vents along the side. She changed hands between a couple of owners, but she now lives on the Thames at Victoria Embankment as a restaurant, having had several overhauls to keep her ageing hull watertight and safe. Back in 1974, however, it wasn't long before her sister ship, the other of the twins, the Wingfield Castle, also suffered a serious engine problem and was removed from service, leaving Lincoln Castle as the only boat. Not a great situation, given that two of the boats had failed within months of one another. Wingfield Castle was bought by Brighton Marina to serve, like Tattershall Castle, as a floating restaurant and was towed down to London to await renovation at Swansea. But the renovation proved to be too expensive for the marina, and poor Wingfield Castle was simply left in London's old King George V dock, where she was gradually robbed of her fixtures and fittings. Her only moment of note during this time was her use in the 1980 film The Elephant Man, where she was featured heavily made up to look like a Victorian packet steamer. But she was in a bad way. Vandalised and rusting, in a last-ditch effort to keep her afloat, several tons of concrete were poured into her hold to plug the leaks, an act which may well have saved her life. Finally, in 1982, it seemed that her fortunes had changed when she was purchased by the Whitbread chain to be taken to Swansea, refurbished and used as a restaurant. She was towed around the south coast, but when she arrived at Swansea, it became clear that somebody should have done some work with a tape measure, because she wouldn't fit through the lock gates. She remained moored at Swansea for 4 years, still neglected, until word of her plight came to Hartlepool Council, who were busy regenerating one of their old docks as a maritime heritage area with museums, and that particular dock also boasted the old shipworks of Sir William Gray and Company, Wingfield Castle's original builders. In 1986, she was towed to Hartlepool and lovingly restored, even to the extent of having an electric drive fitted so that she could move under her own power, albeit without using the steam boiler. She now lives on the dock, serving as a floating museum, although her condition has deteriorated over the decades and she's now closed to the public as a result. So that left Lincoln Castle on its own to operate the ferry. And bearing in mind how unreliable the Tattershall Castle and Wingfield Castle had been once you took away their regular scheduled maintenance and their repairs, that was not a gamble that British Rail really wanted to take. So they managed to commandeer a ferry from the Isle of Wight ferry, the Farringford, a 1948 diesel-electric paddler. Now, Farringford was a stranger to these waters, and it quickly became clear that it wasn't designed for the Humber, and also its crew had no experience on the Humber, because the Farringford frequently broke down, was often late, ran aground on the many mudflats that the Humber crew knew where they were, and often misjudged the extremely powerful tidal currents that run through the Humber. In fact, locals often derided the Farringford as a floating mechanical rubbish skip. But she assisted the Lincoln Castle for 4 years. But it wasn't Farringford that went wrong. On a fateful evening in 1978, Lincoln Castle was heading towards New Holland when the engineers realised something was wrong with the boiler. They're not just a bit wrong, but very wrong. They managed to make the jetty at New Holland, but on further inspection, it appears that the engineer's gut instinct was right. The boiler had suffered a catastrophic failure. This wasn't something that would be a simple mend. You couldn't just whip a part out and replace it. This was systemic. It required the replacement of the entire boiler, which was an expense British Rail was simply unable or unwilling to spend on a boat that was already several years past its sell-by date as far as they were concerned. As the last running paddle steamer in Britain, Lincoln Castle had been earmarked by the National Railway Museum when she retired, but that wasn't expected to be until the Humber Bridge was finished. The sudden and catastrophic nature of her boiler failure took the museum by surprise, and they pulled out of the deal. Luckily, a local nightclub owner bought her, and although his plans to moor her in Prince's Dock as a gastropub were rejected by the city council, he did get permission by East Riding Council to gently beach her on the Hessel foreshore and turn her into a restaurant. She settled there in 1981 until the restaurant closed in '86. And in 1987 she had her funnel removed and her crankshaft cut in order to fit her through the lock gates at Alexandra Dock in Grimsby for a refit for her next role as a floating pub moored in the dock next to Grimsby's Fishing Heritage Centre. Lincoln Castle remained here, her condition slowly deteriorating both inside and out, until finally the pub closed in 2007. Much effort was made to find a buyer, but nobody wanted the poor old boat, and eventually the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society were offered her for free. But after a detailed inspection, they realised they couldn't afford to put her right and even to get her out of the dock, and regretfully had to decline, knowing full well that this meant that the plucky Lincoln Castle, who had bravely sailed around the coast of Scotland and seen off a German fighter bomber, was destined for scrap. Whilst the owners put the vessel up for sale, there were some insurmountable problems for any prospective buyer. Whilst they were selling her for £20,000, the council demanded £50,000 from any new owner for a licence, and that didn't include the cost of dismantling parts of her in order to fit through the lock again. Nor did it account for the need to dredge the silted up lock and the sandbar outside the dock gates. A sunken derelict in the dock also seemed to present a navigation problem within the dock itself when it came to the necessary dismantling. By 2010, she was already being gutted by scrap merchants, despite a hull-based preservation group offering to pay above the odds to buy and retrieve her. And by October, Lincoln Castle was no more. 70 years after her difficult journey to her new home, she finally met her end, the only one of the three castles so far to do so. So poor old Farringford was left to run the ferry for the remaining 3 years that it would exist, which, as we've already seen, its reliability record and its timings were not particularly outstanding. It gave the ferry a fairly bad name in its last few years. And it was occasionally helped out by small pleasure boats from the east coast like the Freshwater and the Yorkshire Belle. But mostly it was left to its own devices. And of course, when the bridge opened in 1981, the ferry was quietly retired. Gone, but not forgotten. And this concludes our three-part look into the history of the Humber Ferry, the history of the boats that worked it, and the history of New Holland, a village and an industrial centre that sprang from out of nowhere simply because of a 19th century gin smuggler. If you've enjoyed this series or any of my other videos, please consider clicking the like button and leaving a comment. And if you would like to receive notifications of new videos, please subscribe to the channel and click the button with the bell icon. If you'd like to help me make these videos, donations are very welcome to the channel's GoFundMe and Patreon pages, both of which are linked in the description below this video. Every donation, no matter how big or small, helps me with research materials, travel and replacement equipment, and it's always very gratefully received.